All right, so what are we doing tonight? Well, taking a cue from our esteemed pastor who described this study in one of the bulletins, exploring Mormonism. That's what we're going to do in these next few weeks. Here's what I plan on us to do, and we'll just see how far we get tonight. But this is kind of the overall plan. First of all, just a few words about why we need this study, why one needs this study, what's important about it. Why does it matter? Then I want to deal with some key issues in some preliminary kind of way that will ease us into a discussion of these topics broadly, and then we'll progressively get more narrow. Then what I would like to do is begin to draw the contrast between us, and I'll say a little bit about what the us means as far as what groups I'm trying to contrast, and Mormons. Are there critical, crucial, important, salient, doctrinal differences? Okay, and that's going to carry the bulk of this presentation. We won't even probably get hardly started on that. And then we need to, in fact, I think a lot of what I'm going to say here is fairly uncontroversial. That is to say, I would submit to you that a Mormon wouldn't disagree with me. They would be as they would admit as much as I would admit of some of the doctrinal differences. Because if there weren't those doctrinal differences, they wouldn't be interested in trying to lead people to what they understand to be the truth. I mean, if they thought we were already there, it wouldn't make any sense for them to try to. And that's the same thing we would do. If we thought that what we believed already concurred with what everybody else was already doing in the world, we wouldn't bother to go out and try to proselytize or evangelize, would we? So I appreciate the fact that in our sort of enthusiasm to be polite to one another and not offend each other, that people sometimes want to focus on the similarities. And we'll say something about that perhaps as we go along. The problem, though, in my judgment, with spending too much time on the similarities and not having enough time to get to the differences in a lot of these kind of issues, is it's sort of like, to me, talking about, let's say you're comparing flour that you bake with and arsenic. And at this point, I'm not making any parallels as to, well, we're the flour and the Mormons are the arsenic or anything, or the Mormons are the flowers and we're the arsenic. I just want you to see the contrast. If you compare flour and arsenic, there's a lot of things that are similar between the two. They're both powders, they're both white, they probably have a similar texture, that kind of thing. But of course, it's not what's common between flour and arsenic that's interesting. It's what's different between them. And unless and until you get to the differences, you really haven't talked about anything interesting, it seems like, regarding flour and arsenic. It's the fact that one's a food and one's a poison. So, when it comes to theological disputes, then if there are theological differences that are critical and that make a difference between life and death, that is spiritual life and death, then that's what we've got to eventually get ourselves to when we talk about it. Come in. We've got to make sure we get ourselves to those differences. And as I suggested, I think a lot of times what I'm going to outline are the differences are pretty straightforward. I think any Mormon is going to agree with me. In fact, I'll just let them talk for themselves because I'll just appeal to their standard works as well as some of their main church leaders as we go along and draw these distinctions. So here's where the controversy starts. Is Mormonism a Christian denomination? And coupled to that very quickly is, well, how do we know the truth about these things? That's really where the rub is going to be. Because my contention is going to be that it's not a Christian denomination. And I'll save for what my contention will be as to how we know the truth of these matters, but we'll have to save that a little bit later. Now, this is obviously going to be the part where Mormons and we would disagree. Some Mormons would characterize, in fact, I'll show you a quote where they will use that word to describe themselves as a denomination. I'm going to try to argue when we talk about some key terms that it's not a denomination in any meaningful sense of the term, that it's a completely different religion. Now, saying that it's a completely different religion doesn't in and of itself say that it's false. But another thing that I've learned over the years in apologetics, in studying world religions and philosophies and things, is that unless and until a person can get to a point where they understand the differences between ideas, we're not in any position to make any kind of evaluation as to what's true and what's false about those ideas. So similar to the arsenic and the flour, until we get to what's different about things, we're not even in a position to say one is true and one is false. In fact, if they aren't different, then maybe they're both true or they're both false. But if they're different from each other, then it may turn out that one is true and the other is false. And then probably the thing that will matter the most and will make the biggest difference is this last one. And how do we know? How do we make these determinations? What kind of criterion of judgment are we to use in evaluation? Do we pray and ask God to show us these truths? Is that how we know? And that He will give us an awareness and a knowledge of the truth of these matters before us? Or is it that coupled with something else? Or is it something else entirely? I want to explore that in somewhat more detail a little bit down the road. All right, so let's begin now for why there's a need for this study.
I'm Alan Wolford. Work on motorcycles for a living. Off-road with my family.
I'm Laura Wolford, and I love to cook all kinds of cuisines. And then I also do design. Alan is just adorable. He doesn't look adorable, but he's adorable. You look at Alan with the choppers on the side, and he's just this big burly guy.
Boy, Laura's quite a gal. To describe her, she's 100 plus miles an hour. I'm pretty happy to go 55 or 60.
He's giving himself credit. He's like 30. He is such a sweet little teddy bear. He cries more than I do.
I worked at the grocery store for 15 years, and I really didn't like the white shirt and tie thing. Finally quit and opened up a little body shop, and it was a great career, something I loved to do.
I got married very young, right out of high school, and it was a bad marriage from the beginning. I knew I just needed to change my life. My
first marriage, I was married for 15 years to a wonderful gal. I started making a few bad choices. I started drinking, and I started drinking a little more. I messed our marriage up, 100% my fault. We got divorced, and of course I hated myself. I hated myself for what I did to my family.
Lucky there's life after divorce and good life after divorce. I met Alan.
The day I met her was a Sunday morning. I had a hangover, as usual. And boy, I think I fell in love with her in a matter of seconds. Head over heels, absolutely crazy in love with her. And she must have been really blind because she fell in love with me too. The day I met her that Sunday morning, it's been 20 years ago. It's the last day I ever drank. And that's an amazing thing to me, because I tried to quit a lot of times. She got me back on the right track. There's never a second goes by in a day that I don't think about that. I mean, I'll be eternally thankful to God for giving me another chance.
He helped me understand what a real relationship is about, and I'm so grateful for him for saving my life.
I'm Alan Wolford.
My name is Laura Wolford, and I'm a mom.
I'm a father. I'm a husband.
I'm a chef.
I'm an off-road enthusiast.
I'm a goer.
I've been sober for 20 years.
I just love life.
I grow funny mustaches.
And I'm a Mormon.
And I'm a Mormon.
Now, no doubt all of you have seen commercials, either this one or others like it, in the media lately. And I wonder, and you don't need to answer out loud, this is just a rhetorical observation and question, but I wonder how many here and others that I've talked to in the past number of months have become interested in this subject almost entirely because of Mitt Romney. And there seems to be no doubt in my mind that this is part of a way of massaging the public ethos to make it more palatable for people to consider having a Mormon president, which makes perfect sense. I mean, that's exactly what I would have expected. If he'd have been something other than Mormon, but yet maybe something that was relatively unfamiliar to the average American, I would have expected his people to try to I don't mean massage in a bad sense, but try to deal with the public mindset to say, look, this isn't some eccentric group. This isn't something that's, that you need to be afraid of, even if it's unfamiliar to you. And so we want to just introduce you to everyday people who deal with the exigencies of life that you deal with, alcoholism, divorce, but have found renewal and hope. And they found it in the Mormon church and in the people that have come into their lives. And so people surely would resonate with that and say, I know exactly what this guy's talking about because I have a similar testimony, or I know someone that has a similar testimony, even if it's not connected with Mormonism. So there's no question that that's what it's for, and I don't say that critically. And I'll save a few words here in a moment to a few more things I want to say about Mitt Romney. And then down the road, if people are interested in the subject, as far as the political aspect of this issue, that'll be something that I'm not shy about delving into, but it is something that I would rather just put off because I don't think it's as critically important as the theological issues there. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Here's another thing that makes me think there's a need for this study. The book came out a number of years ago. It's probably more than 10 years ago now. Co-authored by Craig Blomberg and Stephen Robinson. Craig Blomberg is an evangelical Christian and Stephen Robinson is a Mormon. And they co-wrote this book as a way of exploring their similarities and disagreements. Well, when this book came out, it just caused quite a bit of controversy. I can't speak to how much controversy it might have caused among the Mormon leadership or Mormon membership, but I can tell you as an evangelical and as someone who spends all my time in academic circles, it caused quite a bit of controversy when it came out. Why? Because of statements like this. That conversation epitomized some of the discoveries we made as we worked together on this project, having more in common than we expected, sharing numerous social and moral standards, as well as many of the same theological doctrines, recognizing that not everything evangelicals and Mormons say about each other is true, though some of it is. While I might grant that, well, not everything perhaps that evangelicals and Mormons say about each other is true, maybe that's the case, I will challenge this assertion that there are many theological doctrines that they have in common. In fact, I will assert that there's not one theological doctrine that Mormonism has in common with evangelical Christianity. As I'm trying to think about it right now, I can't think of one. I can think of a lot of broad concepts: God, Jesus, heaven, hell, salvation, church, baptism, marriage. Certainly those things are common in terms of the broad concept and the terminology. But I'm going to try to argue that when it comes to, well, what do they really believe about that? It isn't anything like what we believe. Again, that's not to say that it's false. But before I can even deal with whether one is true or false, we need to make sure we understand we're not saying the same thing. We are not saying the same thing at all. It is as radically different from each other as you could possibly imagine. Except maybe a world religion that wouldn't even have any of the same terminology that we would use. Because evangelicals and Mormons certainly will have a lot of the same terms that we will use. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of the degree to which the consternation this book was met with among evangelicals, it was quickly followed by this book called The Counterfeit Gospel of Mormonism. See the subtitle, The Great Divide, because this one was How Wide the Divide, so this one was The Great Divide. Some of you may recognize some of the contributors: Francis Beckwith, Norman Geisler, Ron Rhodes, Phil Roberts, and Gerald and Sandra Tanner. So I put that up there just to show you that this was not going to go unchallenged as far as whether or not it was even telling the truth about the differences, irrespective of any argument as to, well, they're wrong and we're right or whatever. Even before you get to that, is it the case that that divide is not as wide as Blomberg and Robinson suggested? And I'm going to side with this group here to say that is indeed a great divide. And again, I'm going to try to paint that picture, and then as time allows in the weeks to come, we're going to get into the specifics of, well, how do you know which one is right. Now, I mentioned Mitt Romney a while ago, and, you know, you're not supposed to talk about politics or religion. Well, we've already ruined one of those. We're in church, so we're expected to talk about religion. I have my political views. I'm sure you have yours. I'm not shy about mine, and I know you're not shy about yours. I've already heard how unshy about yours you are. So, you know, we can talk about this. I'm probably not as informed about some of these things as many of you in this room, maybe most of you are in this room. So I would stand to gain a lot from a conversation about the relative merits of a re-election of Barack Obama versus whoever the Republicans are going to be versus maybe a third party. Those conversations are very interesting to me. But since I have already made this, what I'm about to say, since I've already said this publicly on my blog, then I guess it's okay to go ahead and repeat. And I'll just say this. I personally would take a Mormon Mitt Romney over a Baptist Jimmy Carter any day of the week. Okay? That's just my personal opinion. All right? So that's just a way of me flagging. I'm not partisan about this part. Mitt Romney's Mormonism doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I would argue that his Mormonism will really cause him to be committed to some political issues that a lot of conservative Baptists would resonate with. Now, whether he really holds, I don't know specifically. Is he, you know, some people have challenged that he's not as pro-life as he lets on. That's fine. I don't know that. I'm just saying, as a Mormon, he will probably be committed to a lot of conservative social values that you would probably resonate with as a conservative Baptist. Pro-life, pro-family, smaller government, free market capitalism, you know, probably anti-gambling, certainly anti-gay marriage, and a lot of things that I think all of us in this room would probably be in solidarity about. So, again, there's more to this to be discussed. We'll do it at a later time, but, you know, I'm not as worried about him becoming the nominee vis-a-vis his Mormonism. There might be other things that might bother me about him. That's fine. I'm just saying, I regret that some evangelicals are making this an issue, because I think it's the same kind of discussion we had when John F. Kennedy was nominated, and we were all worried about there being a Roman Catholic president, because the concern was, well, if he's Roman Catholic, he has to have allegiance to the Pope, and the Pope is the head of another state. So how can you defend defend the Constitution if you're under the allegiance of a head of another state? Well, we had that conversation, and you might want to make some kind of parallel argument about Romney, but give me Romney over Carter. I realize he's not running, but since he was a Baptist, I had to pick him out of the group. All right. What are some key issues? What are some key issues to deal with? Let me see if I can just deal with some of these. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between core beliefs and peripheral beliefs. We'll say what this is here in due course. And then talk a little bit about some key terms that'll be useful at the very front end. Other terms we'll define as we go along, but there's some at the very front end that need to be dealt with.